Well, I'm sure you probably think the most famous hymn, probably the most famous hymn in our that we know of today in our history is Amazing Grace. I think most people know that. Even unbelievers can probably sing this song. The first stanza is Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. And you know the rest, I'm sure. You've sung it at funerals, at churches, weddings. And now Amazing Grace was written by a man named John Newton. So we want to ask the question, or who was John Newton? Who was John Newton? Well, he was born in London in 1725 to a Christian mother who taught him the Bible at an early age. However, her influence waned from Newton's life when she died of tuberculosis when he was 7. So his father, who was a merchant navy captain, became his primary influence, and there was not much Christian influence from him or from his life. At the age of 11, Newton went on his first of 6 voyages with his father. During this time, Newton abandoned his Christian heritage that he had learned from his mother and became a typical rough sailor. In fact, he lost his first job in the merchant's office because of unsettled behavior and impatience of restraint. He then spent his later teen years out at the sea until, as one author puts it, he was press-ganged aboard the HMS Harwich in 1744, which was a military vessel. Newton, however, rebelled against the discipline of the Royal Navy, and he deserted it to pursue a lover of his, a woman named Mary. His desertion didn't go unnoticed. He was then caught, put in irons, flogged. He eventually managed to convince his superiors not to chuck him in jail for the rest of his life, but they put him on a slaver ship. A slaver ship. What's a slaver ship? A ship that gets slaves. One author writes, espousing free-thinking principles, he remained arrogant and insubordinate, and he lived with moral abandon. In Newton's own words, I sinned with a high hand, and I made it my study to tempt and seduce others. Another author writes, he took up smoking and swearing and indulged his lusts. The God he had learned to worship at his mother's knee seemed a distant being with no claim on his life. Now he was a rough seaman working aboard a ship that traded and delivered slaves. So Newton ended up on the vessel called the Greyhound, a ship bound for the Guinea coast for the slave trade. The captain of this vessel was a friend of his father, and before long, Newton found himself well established in the trade. He was working under the ship's part owner, a man named Mr. Clow, at the slave factory on the Plantain Islands near the country of Sierra Leone. However, things did not work out for Newton. During the next 2 years, one author writes, he suffered illness, starvation, exposure, and ridicule as his master's black mistress used him poorly, and as he lost his master's trust, he became lower than a slave. He became a servant to the human chattel in which his master traded. It was so bad that the slaves ended up taking pity on him. A few of them even snuck him food, helping him. However, instead of thanking God for this little bit of common grace from the very people whom he was buying and selling, Newton surpassed his earlier immorality and began to blaspheme to a degree that shocked even the older men on the ships. And he narrowly escaped death by drowning as he fell overboard when he was having a party. Then in 1748, the Greyhound went on a voyage from Brazil to Newfoundland in Canada. The ship, full of slaves, was caught in a violent storm. The ship was in such a poor condition that everyone thought they were going to die. And it awoke Newton to the reality that he might be swept out to sea and never be seen again. It was this evening whereby Newton called out to the very God whom he remembered his mother teaching him about for help. Newton believed that he was too much of a sinner to be saved by God, but during this storm he clung to the scriptures that spoke of God's grace towards sinners. It was this period that Newton claimed was, as the hymn says, the hour he first believed. In the next few months, his faith was challenged in various ways, but it was only when he fell ill with a deadly fever that he changed his life around. Now he was a changed man. Over the next few years, his position on slavery changed. As his faith matured, he started to have remorse over his involvement in the slave trade. In 1785, he met with the British abolitionist, William Wilberforce, who counseled him to remain in politics rather than pursue a life of ministry, so that together they could abolish slavery once and for all in the biggest empire in the world, the British Empire. It was in this political field that Newton was able to advocate for the abolition of the slave trade. In 1787, he helped Wilberforce found the Society for Effecting the Abolition of Slave Trade, more commonly known as the Anti-Slavery Society. The following year, Newton penned a book entitled Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade. In this book, he gave a graphic account of his personal experiences in this industry. It was this work that created a spark in England. His pamphlet sold out immediately, and the second edition was sent to every member of the Parliament in England. Newton would then go on to testify against slavery at the parliamentary hearings. He continued to preach the gospel, preach about the dignity of man, a man made in the image of God. He died 9 months after Parliament abolished the slave trade in the entire British Empire. That's one man worth knowing. And there's another person worth knowing, Harriet Tubman. Who was Harriet Tubman? Well, she was an African-American woman born into slavery in the 19th century. By the age of 5, she was rented out to her family's neighbors as a domestic servant. However, even at a young age, she wasn't going to be a good slave. At the age of 12, Tubman attempted to stop her master from beating another slave who had tried to escape, but her master ended up hitting her in the head with a 2-pound weight, leaving her with a lifetime of severe headaches and narcolepsy. But despite her trial of slaveship, Tubman was a committed Christian, and it was her Christian faith that led her to believe that humans were not meant to be slaves. And so in 1849, she escaped to Philadelphia from Maryland to escape the slave trade in that area. However, instead of fleeing for good, she believed that she could not leave her family behind. So one group at a time, she brought her relatives out of the state and eventually guided dozens of other slaves to their freedom. She utilized the Underground Railroad, which was a network of escape routes and safe houses established by black and white abolitionists. Her success at freeing slaves in the South led her slave owners to post a $40,000 reward for her capture or death. Imagine $40,000 back then. It's a lot today. However, she was never caught. She didn't lose any passengers. It wasn't long, however, before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, and that required any escaped slaves, even if they were in safe states, to be returned back to their owners. So in light of this new persecution, now the northern states weren't safe anymore. She decided to flee her fugitives north into British North America. We know it as Canada. Why? Why would she go to Canada? Well, because of the work that men like John Newton had done by abolishing the slave trade in the British Empire. Tubman became an icon of courage and freedom and was nicknamed the Moses of her people. And so what do we have here? Here we have two Christians from different places, different times, two Christians who fought against the slavery of their day because of their Christian principles. Two Christians who fought for the abolition of slavery. We have John Newton, who once was the wicked slave trader himself, but then by the grace of God became a slave abolitionist. Then we have Harriet Tubman, born into slavery, but through her faith helped countless slaves find freedom from slavery, and reminding us today that governments can never be the standard of morality, and that sometimes it is okay to civilly disobey them for the glory of God. And as Christians today, we applaud both of them. We read books about them. We are encouraged by them. We watch documentaries on them. But then we read our Bibles and we get confused. Why? Because on the one hand, we are encouraged by these people trying to free slaves, but then we read our Bibles and it speaks about slaves in the Bible. We don't see the Bible denouncing the slave trade. In fact, the Bible has a lot to say about slaves, but the outright abolition of them is not what it says. We are told, on the one hand, by liberal scholars that Jesus was a radical social justice warrior, but the reality is we never see him being revolutionary in the political sense. We don't see him calling out the slave trade of his day directly. So what is going on? So what does the Bible actually teach about slavery? How are we to think about slavery? And it's pretty hard, especially if you grew up in the U.S. You live in a time and country where right now we don't have any slaves, as far as we know. Some people are treated like that, but we don't have any official slaves here. And what makes us very hard is that when we think of slaves, we only think of one type of slave. When we think of slaves, we are automatically brought to remember the slavery by what happened to the people in Newton's and Tubman's day. So we automatically think of 18th and 19th century slavery. But if we want to be good exegetes of Scripture, we can't read modern day things back into the past as if they happened exactly the same way then. We must avoid reading a modern day concept into an ancient concept. There are at least two historical fallacies that we must avoid when interpreting Scripture. There are more, but a fallacy is essentially a faulty way of arguing, a faulty way of thinking. You must avoid the historical word fallacy. That's when you anachronistically, you take a modern day word, and when you see that word used in the past, you think it has the same meaning. As one theologian writes, the meaning of words is determined in the first place by custom and general usage of the way it was used in its day, when the author wrote them. No intelligent author or writer deliberately departs, he says, from the usus loquendi, that is, the current usage that is prevalent in a particular age, without having a good reason for doing so. In other words, you cannot take a modern meaning of a word and think that those before the modern day period meant the same thing. Think of the word awful. That meant full of awe in the 1600s, but today it means something monstrous. The word bully, it originally meant to be a sweetheart. You're my bully. And the word guy in the 1800s used to describe a person of grotesque appearance. The meaning of words change over time, and so we must ensure when you study a word, you study it in its original context. Another historical fallacy you must avoid is the modern thinking fallacy. This fallacy, like the first one, is like it, but the difference is this is about a concept of maybe a philosophy or a theology. Thinking of the modern day theology or concept that was only invented today must have been in the minds of ancient people. Think of critical race theory. That's like thinking CRT, a Western modernized concept of racial division. That's like thinking that was devised recently was in the minds of first century Eastern writers. Basically, we must avoid thinking that the modern day concept of slave and slavery is the same as the ancient concept of slave and slavery. And obviously there are similarities. There's a master and owner relationship. We get that. But when we study things like slaves, we must do our best to interpret what slavery was like in the biblical world rather than taking what we think of slaves in the modern sense and then pushing it back on what happened back then. And what we shall see is that while slavery in the biblical world was still a corrupt system, it was different and sometimes better than the slavery that you and I know. And that's what I want to achieve today. I want to look at slavery in the ancient world, and you might be asking why. What's that got to do with anything? Well, it's because it's my desire to preach through Philemon next, and that's a book where there's slaves in it. One of the main characters is a slave. The other main character is a slave owner. So if we're going to study that short book there, Philemon, I think we have to know a little bit about slaves before we jump into it. And to understand slavery, and especially the relationships between slaves and their masters in the church, is a great text in 1 Timothy chapter 6 that speaks about the relationship between slaves and their masters in the church. And so we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 to 2 today. Now, 1 Timothy is a book about the church, written by the Apostle Paul to his young protege Timothy, about how a church should run, how it should function, what its purpose is. In the later chapters in 1 Timothy, like in chapter 5, Paul helps Timothy, who was a pastor in the church at Ephesus. Paul helps Timothy by telling him how various members in the church should relate to one another. He tells them how different sexes and different ages should relate, widows and elders. And then in chapter 6, Paul's going to help Timothy with the same thing. He's going to help Timothy deal with other relationships that he's going to see in the church. But this one's different. This relationship is not about Timothy's relationship to a group, but for 2 verses, the Apostle Paul will tell Timothy what the slaves in his church, what their relationship should be to their masters. And that's interesting and hard at the same time. Why would Paul tell slaves to have a relationship with their masters? Shouldn't he be calling for them to run away, for their abolition? Shouldn't Paul be addressing masters and their relationships to their slaves? Here it's the other way around. Slaves, this is how you are to treat your masters. And then what is up with Paul and slaves anyway? Why does he speak about slaves so often? And why does he write to a slave owner Philemon and call him a beloved brother and fellow worker? So I'm going to hope to help answer those questions for you today. And so we're going to read the first 2 verses of 1 Timothy chapter 6 to see what we need to know about the concept of slaves and masters. And so let me grab a drink quickly. I'm going to read from the New American Standard Bible. Paul says, verse 1, all who are under the yoke as slaves are to regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. Those who have believers as their masters must not be disrespectful to them, because they are brethren, but must serve them all the more, because those who partake of the benefit are believers and beloved. Teach and preach these principles. And it's from this text we're going to look at 2 concepts of the ancient understanding of slavery, 2 concepts of slavery that we need to know to better grasp this difficult subject, so we can also help interpret Philemon well when we get there, and also how we might learn from the slaves and how they treat their masters as we seek to be good workers ourselves. So we're going to first see a history of slavery, and then slaves in the church. 2 concepts, the history of slavery and slaves in the church. So the first concept, a history of slavery. And so in order to understand slaves and slavery in the ancient world, we have to have a good understanding of their history. So what was slavery like in the biblical times? Well, we must first remember, again, there's not one type of slavery. We can't think slavery is the same in every place and every time. So there's different types of slavery even in the Bible. But now slavery took place before the nation of Israel even existed. How do I know that? Well, remember Joseph in Genesis. He was sold as a slave to Potiphar in Egypt before Israel became a nation. So slavery had existed for many years prior to the nation of Israel. Additionally, the Jewish people, according to Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 to 12, when they were in Egypt, they had taskmasters in charge over them. They had been slaves in Egypt and were treated harshly as slaves. They knew what it was like to be treated very harshly as a slave. Their Egyptian masters were cruel, and so what we can initially learn from this is that slavery is not a new concept that Moses came up with. Now, slavery was already in existence. However, as we know, God saved the Israelites from their slavery. He saved them from their cruel Egyptian masters, and then God said, I will be your master. I'll be your king. You can work for me. In Leviticus 25, verse 42, God tells the Israelites not to subject a fellow countryman to slavery, but rather make him a hired man. Why? Because God says they are my slaves, who I brought out of the land of Egypt. In other words, the Israelites had been redeemed by God. God was their new master, and not cruel like the Egyptian ones. And because of that, they were not to make each other slaves. God was their new master, and he is a better master than the ones they had in Egypt. And God, as their new master, called the Israelites to treat other people humanely, to treat their slaves. If you have slaves, treat them right. God did not orchestrate slavery, but because of the hardness of people's hearts, like divorce, which God hates, God regulates it, ensuring that the people who are going to do this anyway, I'm going to make sure they do it well. The Israelites were called to take good care of even their pagan slaves, and especially any Jewish people who had become slaves because of poverty or war. In Deuteronomy 15, it says that any fellow Hebrew or Jewish people, if they were sold to you as a slave for whatever reason, then they shall only serve you for a maximum of 6 years. On the seventh, you must set them free. And not just set them free, but you shall give them liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your wine vat. Why? Because God reminds the Israelites that you were once slaves in the land of Egypt. And God redeemed and blessed them, and so you must do it to each other. So if someone finds himself in a position because of poverty or war as a slave, and you freed them from their debt for whatever reason, yeah, they'll work with you, but you must free them after a certain time, and then give them enough stuff so that when they leave you, they will be fine, not poor or destitute anymore. You see, the Israelite law never forbade slavery, but carefully guarded the rights of the slaves, because some people, believe it or not, enjoyed being slaves, and they wanted to stay a slave. A poor man might not have anything outside of slavery, but if he found a good master, then he would be abundantly supplied with food and housing. Sometimes, especially in the Roman Empire, we'll see later, being a slave was better than being a free man. Slavery was so different during this time in ancient Israel that in Exodus 21 verse 5, we see Moses allowing slaves to stay with their master if they love their master. If you love your master, you're welcome to stay. Now, that's foreign to us. How can a slave love their master? The Bible says, if you love your master, feel free to stay. Some slaves loved their masters so much that they wanted to stay with their family forever. Those slaves that had bad masters, the Israelite laws protected them by saying that they could get free after some time. Not only that, but the Jews weren't allowed to sell their slaves to foreign people, even if the slave was displeasing to them, protecting them from abuse from other nations who had bad laws. Slaves were also given a day off. They had the day off, unlike the slavery in Egypt. In Exodus 23, verse 12, God commanded the Israelites to give everyone a Sabbath rest, even their slaves. According to Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16, if any slave escaped, if they had a cruel master, then you were not to bring the escaped slave back to their master. In fact, Moses says the slave will live in your midst, in the place he shall choose, and other people may not mistreat him. In Exodus 21, 26 to 27, slaves who were abused by their masters were to be set free. In Exodus 21, verse 20, if you murdered your slave, there was punishment. Foreign slaves seeking asylum, according to Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16, were to be protected. In 2 Samuel 9, 9 to 10, slaves had their own economic rights. They could own their own slaves. Overall, the Jewish system of slavery was not perfect. It was workable. It was not the ideal situation. God made man in his image to own the world, not to own each other. But God made provisions for it. Most of the abuses came from evil men, but God gave laws for Israel to deal with those abuses. And so that was slavery in ancient Israel. But now slavery during the Roman times was very different. It changed significantly. So the slavery you see in the New Testament, you can't go and look at the Old Testament laws and say that's how slavery existed. Israel was not in power right now. The Romans were, and they had their own version of slavery. The Romans had slaves, but they didn't have an all-wise, all-holy, all-loving God regulating their system of slavery. And because the New Testament is primarily about the kingdom of God, rather than the establishment of an earthly nation, Israel, you don't see New Testament laws to deal with these slaves. And what that means is, in order to understand the system of slavery in Paul's day, in Timothy's day, you're going to have to look at Roman accounts, Roman sources, Roman laws, to see how they treated the slaves. We need to look at Roman records and laws to help understand slavery during this era. And so what was Roman slavery like? What was slavery like during the time of Paul's letter to Timothy? When Paul wrote to Timothy about slaves, what was in their mind? What did they understand about slavery? In a nutshell, it wasn't like modern-day slavery. It had more rights than today. It also had nothing to do with your race. Anyone could be a slave, and if you escaped, it would be very hard to find you because you could blend in. But Roman slavery had less protections than ancient Israel had. So how do we understand Roman slavery? Well, let's ask several questions. The first question we can ask is, well, what was Roman society like? What is it like to live in Rome? Many people dream of being Romans and living during this time. So what was it like? Well, the first way to understand slavery and how it worked during Paul's day is to understand how Roman society worked. And to understand Roman society, you have to understand a system called social stratification. So what is social stratification? It's a system that divides people into rigid hierarchical groups, a system that divides society between their classes. And the most prominent one that you might know today is the Indian caste system or caste system, which is the world's oldest surviving form of social stratification. It's a system that divides Hindu people into various ranked groups based on their karma, their work, and their dharma, their religious duty. And the group you're in determines how society will treat you. And basically, the system divides all Hindus into 5 main categories. First, there are the Brahmins, the priests and the teachers. They're the highest class in society. Then there are the Kshatriyas, the warriors and the rulers. That's the second highest class. Then the Vaishyas, the farmers, traders, and merchants. That's the third highest group. Then you have the Shudras, the basic laborers. That's the fourth highest group. Then you have the Dalits, or the untouchables. These are the street sweepers, the latrine cleaners. They're at the bottom of society. And the class you are in determines your religious and your social life. If you were on the lower end, you would never interact with those on the higher end. In fact, the upper and lower castes almost always live in segregated colonies. They often don't share food or water with each other, and often if you can only marry within your own group. And what that means is once you are in a lower system, a lower group, you practically, very rarely, could climb up in life. Basically, it's an evil system that devalues human life and dignity, emphasizes class superiority and pride. But India is not the only nation that has done this. The Roman Empire had its own form of social stratification. If you lived in the Roman world, you were in a certain class of people. And what this means is, if someone was below you, you could boss them around. And they were to give you respect and honor and obey you. At the top of the system were the senators. Then there was the equestrians and the decurions. These three groups were known as the elites in the world. And there were about 1 million of them in the Roman Empire. Below these three groups were the non-elites. These were the freeborn, the freedmen. And then it was the slaves. And in this group, there were about 49 million. So depending on which group you were, depended your social life. The lower you were, the less privileges you had. And so your goal in life would be to try and improve your social standing. The higher you were, the more privileges you had, the more authority you had. And if you mixed with those below you, it was unheard of. In fact, you might even lose your respect if you hung out with people beneath you, unless they were your slaves. The society was so entrenched in this social stratification that during the time of the Apostle Paul's ministry, there was a man on trial who was accused of wearing clothes that were only meant to be worn by the upper class. You can actually read this today. There's a court case about a man who was wearing clothes that were designed for someone above him. It's like being arrested for dressing like someone in Malibu. In other words, you were to dress according to your status. But you were also to eat and sit at dinner parties according to your status, When Romans threw together banquets, the seats were assigned according to your class, the food given out according to your class. Also, you would sit at events according to your social group. If you went to a Roman public theater or a stadium, your class would determine where you sat. On the higher end, you go there. Lower end, you go down there. It wasn't how much you paid. It was who you were. In one Roman town, the punishment for sitting in the wrong section was a fine of 5,000 sesterces. And that's an insane amount if you think about it. And a soldier earned 900 a year. So you'll be fined 5,000 if you sat in the wrong group. Even in death, letting everyone know your social status was important. If you went and looked at some archaeological digs around Roman grave sites, you would see the grave with a ton of writing. Today you would see so-and-so, maybe a little pithy statement, the dates they lived and died. But high-ranking Roman graves had the entire resume on them. Every position, accomplishment they did. It would not be unusual to read a gravestone about a person with 15 to 20 titles or positions that he had. Then finally, your class would determine your influence if you went to trial. If you did a crime or were accused of a crime, your class would be who you were and the society would help you out. If a person of the upper class told the court he didn't think much of you, your chances of being free were much lower. The Roman senator Cicero, he said the courts must treat a person in a manner befitting the justice of his case, so the evidence, and his position. So treat someone's guilty or innocent verdict based on the evidence and who they are in society. There was one Roman trial where a man was being charged with a crime, and he had some witnesses that testified that he had committed it. But during the trial, Publius Servilius, who was a Roman senator, was passing by. And when he saw the trial, instead of passing by, he decided to go and be involved in it. He stopped all the proceedings. So imagine you're having a trial and some random guy walks past. Stop everything. Everything stops. He's a highly respected Roman senator. So what is he going to add to the case? Well, nothing. Nothing of concrete evidence. But what he did have was he had a bit of knowledge about the individual on trial. This is what the senator said. This is his actual words. He said, "Gentlemen of the jury, I don't know where this man on trial comes from or what life he has led or how rightly or wrongly he stands accused. I know only this much, that when he met me as I was traveling on the Laurentine Way in a pretty narrow passage, he refused to get off his horse. Whether that concerns you as a jury, you will judge. I thought I ought not to keep it back." In other words, this man did not get off his horse to respect the senator once in his life. And then when the jurors, after hearing the senator, decided he must be guilty. One Roman author wrote, "They were impressed by Servilius' eminence and his grave indignation at the neglect of his dignity, and they believed that someone who did not know how to respect our leading men would obviously rush into any villainy." In other words, if this person did not respect the upper classes, then he probably would be a criminal anyway. Even if he didn't actually do this, he'd probably be one in the future anyway. So Paul and Timothy were ministering during a time when there was tension between the classes, and slaves were at the lower end of society, outside of their master, that didn't have many rights. But despite the social stratification, Rome needed the slaves. The whole system depended upon slavery. Slavery became the backbone of the Roman Empire and the Roman economy. One historian writes, "The ancient Greeks and Romans independently transformed this long-established and widespread dehumanizing practice of slavery into the foundation for a genuine slave economy. They were low class, but Rome could not function without them. They were economically indispensable, since historians estimate that they were about 16 to 20% of the entire population. So Rome had to enforce many laws to start protecting them. In the beginning, they didn't care too much, but once the economy depended upon these people, once there were so many of them that if they got together, they could overthrow the empire, we should probably start protecting them. Especially since slaves were not just owned by individuals, but corporations and temples could also own slaves, even the government. So the leisure that the Romans and Greeks lived in, it was only possible with the existence of the slaves. Therefore, we need to keep them happy unless they rebel. So the Romans had laws to protect them, and then these laws then facilitated a change in heart to the slaves over time. And so another question we can ask is, well, where did the Roman slaves come from? Where did all these slaves come from? 20% of the population of the empire. Before the first century, most slaves came in from war. You would fight another nation, you would capture many of them, they would be slaves. Or sometimes slaves came by pirates. They would take over ships, come and sell them. But by the time of the Apostle Paul, it was a bit different. The establishment of law and order within the empire finally eliminated piracy, so the empire was against pirates now. So no more pirates. So we can't get slaves from pirates anymore. So now there was less incentive to steal people. Also, after the death of Augustus Caesar, the great wars that the Roman Empire was involved with were largely ceased. So now there's no new nations to go and get their slaves, get their people and become slaves. So where are these slaves going to come from? Well, the main source for slavery during Paul's day was breeding. Under Roman law, children born to slaves were slaves at birth. There were other sources like people willingly selling themselves into slavery to avoid debt and poverty. There were many instances of parents, Greek, Roman, Jewish, who sold their kids into slavery because they couldn't support them anymore, or they thought their kid will have a better life as a slave. One author writes, Roman slavery was by no means an ideal situation, but it was often much better than modern men are inclined to think. In fact, not only did you receive housing and work, but depending on your master, you could find a favorable position to rise the ranks of society. If you were a slave to a good Roman senator who would treat you well, educate you more, you could soon rise the ranks of society pretty quickly. Even as a slave, you could do that. In fact, you were more likely to rise the ranks of society as a slave of a senator than if you were a free man. Foreigners would also sell themselves as slaves in the Roman world to eventually become free men in the empire. If the right master bought you, you could rise up the ranks faster than you would yourself. Another question we could ask is, well, then how were these slaves treated? So Paul speaks about slaves, Bible speaks about slaves in the New Testament. How were they treated? Well, no one can make a blanket statement because there were always exceptions. But the one thing all slaves had in common was they had a master. So depending on who your master was would depend on how you were treated. A person's experience in slavery depended entirely on the customs of his owner's family. And so there's many accounts of good treatments of their slaves and other accounts of bad treatments. Some Roman slaves were treated well. Some slaves were given great opportunities to better themselves. They were destitute before. They get brought into a Roman home. He gets educated, fed, given housing, given status, given trade, becomes better off, becomes a free man, has a better life. There were those situations. Romans used their slaves for all different tasks. They used them in business, in civil service. Some slaves were doctors and nurses, others teachers and advisors. One Roman author and philosopher, Pliny, he sent his young accomplished slave, Zosimus, he sent him on a cruise to Egypt to find some doctors to help him with his sickness there. Many slaves were valuable property. Some slaves were even more educated than their masters. I mean, if you had a slave that you got from some land, he was a doctor there, an engineer there, whatever, an architect there, he probably knew a lot more than you did. But he's your slave now, so they're pretty useful. One author writes, slaves could be doctors, musicians, teachers, artists, librarians, and accountants. But there were also accounts of great cruelty, since Rome was a warrior state. They were founded and they instituted their life based on violence. So there was going to be some violent situations. One such example was a very rich Roman freedman named Vedius Pollio, who allowed his flesh-eating fish to feast on his slaves. But generally, there seems to be more positive examples than negative ones, the ones, at least of the accounts we have. That doesn't mean the system was right, but it does mean the system was very different than the modern day slavery. This is because slaves were seen as good investments. And when a slave suffered, you would suffer. A sick or injured slave would be detrimental to you and your work, and it would cost you a lot of money to replace the person. During the first century, the living conditions of slaves were improving. Legal and public opinion supported the better treatment of slaves. This was because most slaves during this period of the empire were born into slavery rather than coming in from war. So these are pretty much Roman through and through, these people. And so slaves became more and more like the people whom they used to be, more than the people than they were. In AD 20, the Roman Senate decreed that slaves accused of crimes were to also be treated in the same manner as a free man. Not only that, but more and more, slaves were given more opportunity to be free. The average length of a Roman slave was 7 years. Many chose to stay slaves because they had housing and food, and depending on their master, they could rise up the ranks. And if they were on the outside, they might end up poor again. So many thought they would be better off staying slaves. In fact, slave treatment became so much better that in the entire first century in the Roman Empire, there was little to no slave unrest. There's no rebellion of slaves in the first century of the Roman Empire. One author writes, by the time of the Christian era and the writing of 1st and 2nd Timothy, sweeping changes had happened that introduced that radical improvement of the treatment of slaves. Slaves under 1st century Roman law could generally count on eventually being set free. And we call this manumission, when you set the slave free. Very few slaves reached old age. Slave owners released their slaves at such a high rate that Augustus Caesar had to actually start making restrictions, because this is our economy. We can't just make everyone a freeman right now. Despite this, inscriptions indicate that almost 50% of slaves were freed before they turned 30. And then the fourth question we can ask is this: well, does the Bible then call for the abolition of slavery? Now, while ancient slavery in Israel and Rome was more humane than modern-day slavery in the American African slavery of the 18th and 19th century, the practice is not ideal still. The buying and selling of a person is always going to be subhumane because that person is made in God's image. Thus, any system that denigrates the image of God in man is a system that's not ideal, obviously. And obviously some systems will do it more than others. Now, Israelite slavery, even though it was only in existence because of a fallen world, and thus not part of God's original plan was for man to own the nature, not each other, and that would work for their master God perfectly. But because of a fallen world, God nevertheless used and regulated Israelite slavery to actually give the Israelites their dignity back, should they find themselves in a position in life whereby things are just really bad. So Israelite slavery, even though like divorce, was not part of God's original plan, God nevertheless regulated to ensure his people are protected should they ever find themselves in it. What about Roman slavery? Does the New Testament call for the end of that form of slavery? The thing is, Paul, even though he didn't openly advocate for the abolishment of the entire system, he did tell individual Christians in 1 Corinthians 7:21 that if a Christian is a slave, and if he has the opportunity to get free, do it. Do it. Christianity recognizes that freedom with little wealth is often better than slavery with much wealth. Why? Because Jesus said a man cannot serve two masters. And the Bible describes Christians as slaves of Christ. Jesus bought us with his blood. He is the Christian's master. And so if you are a slave, you have two masters, and you're going to encounter problems along the line. So it's best, if you can get free, to do it. But not only did Paul call for slaves to seek freedom if possible, Paul was against the act of selling and buying people. In 1 Timothy 1:10, Paul makes a statement that those who are slave dealers, kidnappers, who go and steal, kidnap, traffic people for whatever purpose to sell them, he says they are sinning and need to come to faith. The word in 1 Timothy 1:10, the New American Standard Bible translates as kidnapper. It's a compound word with the words man and foot, and refers to someone who catches by the foot. It refers to those people who trafficked in human slaves, who stole people like a pirate and sold them for whatever purpose. In the Old Testament, kidnapping of any sort was a capital offense. Exodus 21, verse 16, he who kidnaps or literally steals a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Wasn't your goal to create the slave? If you wanted to voluntarily become one, because of whatever reason, that was different. This type of slavery was different than much of the slavery mentioned in the Old Testament, which was much more about saving people out of poverty voluntarily. This kidnapping has to do with the unlawful intent of stealing and selling someone against their will. In other words, the Bible, whilst protecting slaves, is pro-freedom rather than enslavement. Again, it's like divorce. In the Old Testament, you see protections for the divorced woman. And like I said, God hates divorce, but he recognizes because of the hardness of people's hearts, it will happen anyway in the fallen world. And so God, knowing this, then wants to protect people if they find themselves in these positions. Even when they're going against his original design, he still wants to protect them. Think of orphans as well. The fact that one's parents die when you're a child, that's not part of God's original plan. But because of sin in this world, he makes protections to protect the orphans. God's original design for humans is freedom from sin and sinful systems, not slavery. However, because of the sinfulness of man, God's original design would be attacked, but he still made provisions for these situations. So yes, God is pro the end of slavery, not part of his original design. He is the only master that's good enough to truly own us. That's why he tells Christians to seek freedom rather than enslavement if possible. Not only that, but the gospel would be the Christian's primary means for destroying the concept of slavery. That's how Paul can say in Galatians 3:28 about the power of the gospel. That it can go through anyone. He says there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free man, neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. The gospel is what will change people's attitudes towards antagonism. The gospel changes the antagonism between Jews and Gentiles, between females and males, and even between slaves and free men. But in the meantime, slavery still exists. And while many Christians in the church are still slaves during this time, how will they treat each other? That's where Paul will help Timothy. Now, this point is going to be much faster than the first one. But we're going to look at the next concept of slaves in the church. Slaves in the church. We're going to the text we read earlier. Because often when we look at passages like 1 Timothy 6:1-2, we are very tempted to immediately run to the application. You will run to, this is an employee-employer situation. Now you need to slow down on going to your application because you're going to miss out on some great things here. And while there are certainly similar principles to glean from, what I just described to you is very different than your job right now and how you are to treat your boss. It's very different. So don't try and automatically say, this is employee-employer relationship stuff. There are similarities we can learn from, but this is primarily slave-master stuff. Very different than what we experience. So I'm going to read first verses 1 and 2 of 1 Timothy 6 again. In light of all that either great background information or nonsense I just said, let's read this text again and see if we can understand it a bit more clearly. So verses 1 and 2, all who are under the yoke as slaves are to regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. Those who have believers as their masters must not be disrespectful to them, because they are brethren, but must serve them all the more, because those who partake of the benefit are believers and beloved. Teach and preach these principles. So what we have here, so 1 Timothy is about the church. So what we have here is the Christian slave in the church, how they should respond to their masters. Principles that Paul says to Timothy, teach and preach these principles. This is a big deal. 20% of the empire are slaves. High chance there are slaves in your church. Especially in Ephesus. In fact, one source estimates that there were about 60,000 slaves in the city of Ephesus alone. and the city only had about 250,000 people. So there's a high chance many people in your church are slaves, Timothy. So what will you tell the slaves in your church? Should they start a rebellion? Overthrow their masters? Find the masters in your church? Throw stuff at them? Beat them up? No, Timothy, I want you to preach and teach to your slaves in your church, all who are under the yoke. I want you to tell them to regard their own masters as worthy of all honor. In the same way the church ought to honor their elders in 1 Timothy, in the same way families in your church are to honor widows, in 1 Timothy we see that as well. I want you guys to, same word, honor your masters. Now bear in mind, this slavery is different than modern day slavery, but nevertheless, Paul did not want Christians in these churches to simply be known as insurrectionists. And instead, Christian slaves, regard your own masters as worthy of all honor. But why? Why? How is this Christian? Well, Paul tells them why. So that's a purpose clause. Let me tell you why. This is the reason. So that the name of our God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. If the Christian slaves during Paul's day rebelled, the name of God would be spoken against. The word spoken against literally means to be blasphemed. But what makes that bad? Well, first, it gives a bad reputation to God and His Word. Overthrowing the government here would not have done much for the glory of God. Not only that, but you would probably lose. As a handful of you try to take down the Roman Empire, you would probably die. And Christianity would be under more persecution than it already was. Imagine for a moment what this would look like if the Christian slaves rebelled. What would that look like? Well, first, like I said, there wouldn't be too many of them. Christianity was still a very small group of people, a small sect at this time. But what would probably have happened is that the Romans would have seen Christianity as a threat. And what do the Romans do with threats? They destroy the threats. They kill them sooner than they did they would kill them sooner than they did in history. In fact, there were times in the history of the church where people got together and tried to rebel and overthrow the system. In the 1530s, during the Reformation period, a group of Anabaptists revolted against the German town of Munster. That took control over it. They called it the New Jerusalem. However, the German government at the time didn't take kindly to the revolt. The rebels were defeated in June 1535, and the king of the rebellion, John of Leyden, was tortured and killed, and they made his remains rot in a cage for everyone to see, right in the Thai building. And if you went there today, that cage is still there. And then after the rebellion was quelled, the Anabaptist movement was tainted all over Europe, so everyone else said, well, let's just kill these guys. They're going to take over the place. So both the Reformers and Roman Catholics looked at them with suspicion, and they stopped seeing them as a religious movement, but instead saw them as a national threat. John MacArthur writes, "It is significant that the New Testament nowhere attacks slavery directly. Had Jesus and the apostles done so, the result would have been chaos. Any slave insurrection would have been brutally crushed and the slaves massacred. The gospel would have been swallowed up by the message of social reform. Further, right relations between slaves and masters made it a workable social institution, if not an ideal one." Now, I'm not saying there's no time a Christian can ever engage in taking down systems like this. We're told in Proverbs 31, verse 8, to speak for those who cannot, fight for the rights of those who do not. We must obey God, not men. But for the majority of the time, Christians, even in adverse circumstances, shouldn't just be rebels just because they don't like something, but should be people of honor. Even those slaves in Ephesus, they were to give honor to their masters. Again, that doesn't mean there are never a time to do things or stop things, but there are means and ways of doing that. And then in verse 2, it brings an additional thing for Timothy to deal with in this church. not only will Timothy have slaves in his church, but he'll also have slaves who have believing masters, Christian slave owners. Paul says they must not be disrespectful to them because they are Christian. But why would a Christian be disrespectful if his master is a believer? Or maybe some slaves thought that since they were Christian just like them, then they don't have to work anymore. Maybe they thought they could get away with things. Maybe have an easy ride. No, Paul says no. If they have Christian masters, they must be even more respected. You want to work even more. In Ephesians 6, 5-8, we see Paul saying something very similar to the Christian slaves in the same city. He said, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free." And so if we take both these texts together, we can learn several truths about the hardworking slave. And the application is pretty straightforward, but now I think it's more profound, understanding the system of slavery, than if you immediately went to employee-employer situation. If a slave can be called upon God to work not for eye service, but for God, and how much more can free men like us work hard? We've lost the Protestant work ethic in our world. It was a thing. Christians worked hard. I think we've lost that. If a slave can work for his master, knowing that there are eternal rewards awaiting him or her, and how much more can we? Because at the end of the day, Paul wants the Christian slaves, and by application he wants all workers today, to know this, that while we work for men on earth, even if they are our earthly masters, ultimately we are all working for our true master, Jesus Christ. And when you work hard, when you work well, when you stop complaining, when you work behind the scenes, when you honor your bosses, you are actually doing a service to God. God gets glorified through your work. If you grew up Roman Catholic, you probably were taught that the only work that God's pleased with is with sacramental work, religious work, priestly work. But the reality is all work, if done with Christian principles, can honor God. When you work hard as a secretary, as a teacher, as a businessman, whatever you do, you can bring glory to God in your work. Slaves could bring glory to God in their work. Yes, they should seek freedom if possible, but being a slave never gave them a right to sin. They still must bring honor and glory to God even in their plight. But the scary thing is, whilst we think slavery is a thing of the past, slavery is still in existence today in many countries around the world, in many different forms. Now, it might not be the same form as it was in ancient Rome and Israel, but according to the website antislavery.org, about 50 million people in the world are trapped in slavery right now. And modern slavery has many different faces, including trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage. In fact, according to Revelation 18:13, slavery will be a major part of the human system in the future, in the tribulation times. We'll be back. And we must remember that even though slavery was better in ancient times, at least in Israel and Rome, it was still an imperfect system that sees humans made in God's image as commodities. All people have value, have dignity, and as Christians we speak against evils of this world, but we must be reminded that the greatest weapon we have against evils is not your vote, it's not your political fortitude, it's the gospel. For the apostles, the gospel was the greatest weapon against slavery. John MacArthur says, Christianity sowed the seeds of destruction of slavery. It would be destroyed not by social upheaval, but by changed hearts. And the book of Philemon illustrates this example. Paul does not order Philemon to free Onesimus or teach that slavery is evil, but by ordering Philemon to treat Onesimus as a brother, Paul eliminated the abuses of slavery. Or as another writer says, the principles of the gospel not only curtailed slavery's abuses, but destroyed the thing itself, for it could not exist without its abuses. To destroy the abuses of slavery was to destroy slavery itself. And it hasn't changed for us today. Whatever evil system you are confronted with, there are things you can do, other things you can do. But the gospel is your main weapon. We are gospel people, preaching the gospel to those whom we live with, work with. And when the gospel takes shape in people's hearts, workers work better, employers treat their workers better. You can legislate immorality, you can make laws to stop people doing evil things, but you cannot make laws to make people be good. Only the gospel can do that. If you want reforms to come to any country, if you want workers to work well, for the economy to be better, your main weapon is the gospel. Christians work harder. Don't steal. Too many Christians jump into the bandwagon of social justice, thinking that if so-and-so gets elected, or if this happens, if this law gets passed, then the world will be so much nicer. It might be alright. Might be not as bad as it could have been. But the gospel is what's going to change people. In John 15:15, Jesus tells his disciples, I'm no longer calling you slaves. Because a slave doesn't know what his master's doing. But I'll tell you what your father does. Therefore, I call you friends. The gospel transforms us, yes, from slaves of sin to slaves of Christ. But we're not just slaves. Jesus calls us friends, acquainted with our master's way. When the gospel changes you, you're a slave of Christ, but you're also a friend of Christ. Once an enemy, now seated at his table. And that's what Paul wanted Timothy to know. That's what he wants us to know. And that's the type of knowledge we need to have as we jump into Philemon next. Let's pray.